mentioned earlier that I don't have a lot of time this week for big videos, but I did want to do a couple little videos. We had our Jordan Peterson Meetup last night here at the church, and it was well attended. A few brave souls allowed themselves to have their picture taken. And one of the things I just wanted to give a few takeaways from the meeting. One of the things that has been interesting to me is that the Jordan Peterson audience has a lot of people with jobs or lifestyles that facilitate long-form YouTube listening. That should seem self-evident, but one of the interesting things that I've learned through this process is how many different walks of life people, whether they might have a job in IT where they spend a lot of time behind a keyboard and they can listen to something all day, and so YouTube provides them an opportunity to watch university courses to enrich their minds. There's only so much music you can listen to all day. And so a lot of the Peterson fans have the opportunity to digest 2-hour videos, and a vast majority of, or a whole lot of other people don't. And that gets into the question of reach, the penetration into the general population. One of the people who came said that he went to a physical bookstore. I didn't know we had any of those anymore. He went to a physical bookstore and wanted to pick up a number of copies of 12 Rules for Life to be able to give it to friends. And so he asked the bookstore people about the book, and some vague looks. And many of you who have been watching Jordan Peterson videos are sometimes challenged to give a brief explanation about who this guy is and what he believes, and that's not easy at all. And so one of the things we discussed quite a bit was his reach into the general population, and one of the things that we thought that this is, even though if you live in your little intellectual dark web bubble on the internet, Jordan Peterson and the Weinstein brothers and all of these conversations might be, ringing around in your head, but nobody else knows anything about these people. And so their impact in the broader culture is quite a bit smaller than a lot of Peterson fans imagine. David Brooks at the New York Times, and why can't I think of her name? Over at the Wall Street, Peggy Noonan at the Wall Street Journal. They might have written, fairly approving articles of him, but they page through the book and then they write a piece and then they're off to the next thing. And the kind of enduring influence is something that requires institutions, a point I made in the Billy Graham video. I dropped another link in that Billy Graham video. George Wills did a piece on Graham in the Washington Post too. And in that piece, actually, there were a considerable number of statistics that really helped show the significance of Billy Graham. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a number of people who watch these videos and watch Jordan Peterson have little or no contact with the evangelical church movement, or are under 70 years old, so have no idea who Billy Graham is or why he was such an influential figure in American history. But that just goes to show you how much inertia there is out there, how people, it's so hard to impact people and get relevance and influence. Now, I read a couple of things. I've been conversing with the San Francisco Meetup people a little bit, and someone posted a Jordan Greenhall post that was interesting on situational assessment of 2018. He talked a lot about media collapse, disruption of the broadcast mediums by YouTube, and in one of the little videos where Peterson responds to Vice Media and talks about that. Peterson in that video is talking about the collapse of the broadcast media, and whereas I think that's true, it isn't true yet, and it's not exactly clear how it will be true. Every time, where's my Neil Postman book about amusing ourselves to death? It's right here on my table. Every time there's a disruption, television disrupted print, the internet disrupts television. These disruptions are not linear events. They print hasn't gone away. Broadcast media hasn't gone away. And I think Jordan Greenhall talked about disruption and talked about Donald Trump. And one of the things about however you feel about Donald Trump, love him or hate him, you feel something about him. And he takes all the oxygen out of the room, and he's got a way to keep himself in the media all the time. And, that is a power in and of itself. And so Peterson's talking in this video, which I won't play right now. Peterson's talking about, the media just falling apart and how it should fall apart. And yeah, but not yet. And even though you might have 750,000, 800 subscribers on YouTube, what is that compared to who's watching Duck Dynasty or the Kardashians or Fox News or ABC News or MSNBC, or who watches the State of the Union event? Now there's a lot going on in that, and it's a very messy process. And of course, we're just talking the United States. We're not even talking Canada or the rest of the world. So it's by no means clear what this path of disruption will look like, and it's by no means clear how all of this is going to shake out. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had in the last few days with a number of Jordan Peterson fans has been on media disruption, and we simply don't know what disruption is going to look like, and a lot of people have a lot of concerns about what it will look like. One of the most interesting takeaways of our meeting was I brought up that Jordan Peterson is having a book tour, so there's another event May 9 in San Francisco, and I just asked the group, there were 10 of us there, how many of you should we do a little field trip and go see Peterson in San Francisco to see the book tour? Who wants to pay $55 or $100 to go into that event? Nobody raised their hand, which was interesting because four of us in the room there, plus a few others that weren't there last night, four of us in the room had paid $75 or more to go see Peterson at the simulation event. I put the link to that simulation video in the video that I did the review of it. And what was so interesting is that there's kind of a satiation point that a lot of hardcore Jordan Peterson people have listened to. We've gone through Maps of Meaning. We've gone through Personalities. We've gone through the 15 things in the biblical series. We watched how many different interviews, and there's a sense of, okay, I've heard the same thing over and over. I've heard about tickling the rats with the eraser, and I've heard about the little spring, and I've heard about Jane Goodall and the apes. And so it's, folks have reached kind of a satiation point. They're reading the book, or maybe they're not reading the book. And so it's interesting that here again, you have a question of, okay, how can influence continue? Now, what was also interesting is that most of the people said they'd be willing to travel to San Francisco to meet up with a group in San Francisco of other Peterson fans to talk about Peterson. In other words, this probably people who are high in openness are the early adopters who are first getting interested in Jordan Peterson. They want to keep entering into that unexplored territory, and that unexplored territory means other Peterson fans who have thoughts and ideas. And what was interesting about our meeting last night is we met formally for 2 hours, and then some of us stayed for another 2.5 hours. There was a tremendous appetite for conversation, and I made an agenda, and I always I'm a pastor, so I bring things to facilitate the meeting just in case things slow down, because I'm responsible for facilitating the thing. That's what pastors do. I didn't need any of that. This group, you just, off you go, and bing, 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 bing. Very intelligent people. People could listen. People could talk. They respected each other. We've had 2 meetings now in Sacramento, and both have just been terrific. And so then you begin to wonder, okay, where is Peterson in terms of the movement, and what will happen to this movement? How can the movement be stewarded? Movements themselves are the things that change history. Leaders spark movements, but the relationship between leaders and movements is always far more complex than I think the low-resolution images we tend to have. So nobody wanted to pay the money to see Peterson talk about his book, because most of us feel we've heard it. but there was a lot of energy and desire to meet with other Jordan Peterson fans. So one of the things that we'll probably do is I've been talking to the San Francisco Jordan Peterson meetup people, and we'll plan an event or something like that where we can all get together and continue the conversation. Another topic that we picked up on last night was what's next for Peterson. What does Peterson need to do to continue to increase influence, credibility, and visibility? And one of the points that I've been making about this has been institutions. Peterson is going to have to think about institutions. And I made the comment yesterday in my Billy Graham video. He's going to have to, Billy Graham built an institution behind him, and that was vital. If you think about Jesus, now I'm not saying Peterson is Jesus, okay? Let me put that plainly. Jesus is my master. Jordan Peterson is not my master. But here's a question. Where would Jesus be without the church? And you might look at the church and say, oh, the church is corrupt. The church has failed me, blah, 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 blah. Where would Jesus be without the church? The institution. Think about the relationship between Jesus and the institution. Jesus never wrote a book. The sayings we have from Jesus were recorded, number of years after the fact by disciples and followers for disciples. In fact, some of the earliest books are the epistles of Paul in the New Testament. And so the Gospels, in fact, come a little bit later. And at some point, I want to do a deeper dive into the Russell Brand interview with Jordan Peterson, because there's some real good gold to mine out of that video. But at one point, Russell Brand makes the comment about, Jesus outside the Gospels. And to me, again, this is like, well, Brand, you don't know much about the New Testament because you don't understand how the New Testament works, or, what the Gospels are, in a sense. And so another person in the group, a very sharp guy, had this idea. And when he first said it, I thought, I don't know if I like that idea. He said Peterson needs to keep getting into and winning fights. And again, the member of the group, oops, bumped the table. The member of the group said that, and I thought, well, I don't like that idea. That just sounds. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, no, he's right, because it's been these fights that has propelled Peterson, because he. It was the fight after he made the C16 video on campus and the protesters against him, and it was the fight with Kathy Newman, and now it's the Vice video fight, and so it's Peterson. Rex Murphy wrote a piece in the National Post in Canada that basically made this point. Every time someone attacks Peterson, he gets more visibility. And I thought a lot about that, and I think this comment is right. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, he really doesn't need to go out there and pick fights. He needs to keep doing what he keeps telling the rest of us to do, which is to be honest and to not lie. And again, when he says lie, I think you have to understand exactly what he means, and this is the same thing with his lying pastors, to use speech for manipulation and to control outcomes. And so this I think was on full display when Peterson tried to explore issues like lipstick and high heels. And what was amazing for that is that, again, when I listen to Peterson, I think about the church, because when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, in these little backwoods churches of mostly Haitians in the Dominican Republic, women weren't allowed to wear lipstick or makeup or anything like this. Now, what's with that? Now, there's some biblicism and legalism about certain remarks that Paul had made in the New Testament, but one of the things that churches have been dealing with for a very long time are all these kinds of issues. Not necessarily sexual harassment, although certainly that does happen in churches, and many of you know very prominent stories about churches and sexual harassment and sexual abuse. But it's long been an issue in churches, because churches are communities that have a fairly high profile moral standard. And so these standards put expectations on people. There was a story my grandmother told me. When my grandmother was a little girl, she went to church one Sunday, and talk about technology disruption. Apparently what had just come out Now we're talking my grandmother, so this is the beginning of the 20th century. She went to church with flesh-colored stockings, and an elder of the church stopped her and was about to, was about to verbally discipline her for showing up in church without stockings. And my grandmother, who was always a spitfire, kind of, looked up at the man and said, "I am wearing stockings. I'm wearing flesh-colored stockings." And, this was revolutionary at Oakdale Park CRC in Southeast Grand Rapids in the very early 1900s. So, and in churches all the time, so Miss So-and-so comes to church wearing that red dress or wearing that red hat, and, comes to church wearing a plunging neckline. And, these are issues of sexual display and sexual attractiveness. And one of the points Peterson wanted to make in that Vice video is, do we talk about these things? Can we talk about these things? In what place can we talk about these things? And part of Peterson's big point about what's going on in public right now is we don't have good spaces to have good, nuanced, in-depth, intellectual conversations. Well, we have this now on YouTube. And again, one of the things that I've been mining, the conversation in text is different from the spoken conversation. And we ought to be aware of the nuances and the differences in there. And so, again, thinking about media disruption, broadcast media as a source of news is collapsing under the weight of societal decay and soundbitism. And this kind of disruption will be chaotic. And a quote I picked up by Albert Maisel from the Russell Brand interview. Russell Brand actually offered this quote: "Tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance." And I think in many ways that really sums up. Tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. And when you look at what commercial news organizations have done to try to gin up eyeballs and attention and focus, is you remove nuance and you grab the most salacious, the most outrageous, the most clickbaitable thing, and that's what you keep promoting. And so Fox News keeps promoting it one way, MSNBC keeps promoting it another way, CNN wants their way, and, as the point that Peterson's made many times, you have the difficulty of sitting down and having a conversation. Now, the only televised news I can stand is NewsHour and PBS, because PBS, every news outlet will have its agenda because all people have biases. You simply have to take that into account. But at least NewsHour often tries to have longish conversations. But here via YouTube we can actually do this, and it's far more open and broad. So these were some of the takeaways from our February Sacramento Jordan Peterson Meetup meeting. And our group, we've had 2 meetings, and the second meeting was bigger than the first meeting, and new faces came out, and it was just a wonderful evening. So I really appreciate all of you who did in fact come out. And if you're in Sacramento, I'll keep using meetup.com and post our next meetings up there. So if you're in Sacramento, come on in. We've had a great time. And again, I think, to get back to the point I was making before, that I think the real, this is really what Peterson teaches. If you're learning something from Peterson, if you're finding something valuable in his work, the best way to respond to it is to, in fact, speak the truth, to get active. And my admonition is find other people who are interested in this and start building face-to-face relationships. Start having conversations. And again, if you've seen my other videos, this is why the church exists. If the church didn't exist, would you know anything about Jesus? In other words, and as I get into further my continuing development of my conversation about mythology and reality and materialism and spirituality and metaphysics, the direction this is going in is that the more real this can be in multiple layers, the more real it is. So in other words, all these ideas you have from Peterson, all these dreams you have for your life, as long as they say dreams and ideas, now I don't want to dismiss dreams and ideas, they have power. And I appreciate the quote that Peterson uses of Jung that, do people have ideas or do ideas have people? That's a powerful quote. The most power comes when ideas and people and materiality and spiritual and metaphysics all line up. And that's to me why I'm a crunchy Christian who believes that when Jesus rose from the dead, Thomas touched his hand. That Jesus, on one hand, had the kind of body who could show up in a room, in a locked room, and on the other hand, had the kind of body who could eat a fish. And all of the New Testament descriptions of the resurrection seem to indicate that they were witnessing something they were not fully able to describe in language. And one of the things that I bump into when we have our Peterson conversation is that people are at the edge of their learning curve, and they're always trying to articulate what they know, but they can't quite put it into words. And what happens when the Logos becomes flesh is exactly that. The words become flesh. And just like I had in my little Felix the Cat exclamation point that some of you have seen in my past videos, this is what we're talking about. So there's my report from the February Sacramento Meetup group. Leave a comment in the comment section.